Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everyone. It is so nice to have you here so that you can hear a conversation with a guest we've had on the show before, but someone who we love having on this show, someone who has a wonderful and insightful perspective and a great story to tell. Pamela Nickel Williams, who is the author of Clearly Lies Are True, about not only her upbringing in Scientology, but issues with and dealings around her family and family system. So it is my pleasure to have what is going to feel like kind of reconnecting with, but also hearing the continuation of a story with someone who really has spent a lot of time thinking through about how trauma, how experiences shape us, and how we can grapple with them as we become adults in the world. Here's Pamela now. Back by popular demand, we have Pamela Nickel Williams with us, who has been on the show before and who was able to talk to us about her story of growing up in Scientology, but also it's a family story. It's a parent-child story. It's a control story. It's a story also about devotion to an organization over others, over anything else at times, and what that does, I think, to the next generations. And, there were so many wonderful things and really powerful things that we heard about your life growing up. And since that time that we've talked, a lot has happened in your life with your book coming out and now having some time passed where people are responding to it and getting in touch. And I'd love to talk to you more about all of that. That is its own journey. And so welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rachel. It's really great to be here again and to speak with you again. It has been a journey, that is for sure. And, my book was released almost a year ago, August 31st, 2025. So we're coming up on that anniversary date. And, when I first wrote my story, it was about healing. It was about trying to deal with memories that had resurfaced or just had begun to surface about sexual abuse that I really had repressed, from my life. And woven in with those was my Scientology story of growing up as a second-generation Scientologist. And so in writing Clearly Lies Are True, I just wanted to heal. I wanted to make sense of what had happened to me, as many survivors from cults or sexual abuse or any kind of trauma want to do. And in telling my story, I thought, well, I'll probably connect with some other Scientologists maybe, who have also told their stories because I'd read so many of those and felt like, okay, now I'm probably part of that club because I've decided, to share my story. But what has been most surprising to me in going out to bookstores and being at book festivals and talking with readers, which has been the most powerful part of this journey, is that my story is not just a story about Scientology and being a second-generation Scientologist and being sexually abused by my dad. My story is universal. It's a universal story of growing up within, a high control group. We call them cults now. I mean, the Church of Scientology, still says it's the church. And that, because of its tax-exempt status, has that it's a religion, but we know it's a cult. And anyone who's grown up in a cult or a high control religion where the way that you think, the way that you behave, the secrets that you have to hold, are part of the organization, people could relate. And, definitely the sexual abuse piece, so many people have related to. in telling my story. And I've just been astounded by people that have come up to me when I'm at a bookstore and have said, I have to read your book. And I said, oh, do you know something about, my story? And they said, well, no, I have just left. And then they'll talk about a high control religion that they just left, maybe an evangelical, high control religion. I've also had people that come up to me because of the sexual abuse piece once they learn that that's a piece of it. And they're a little more, what do I want to say, reticent maybe about that, because I had these young girls that came up to me, teenagers, and they were talking to me about my story and just kind of, getting a feel for it. And then I said to them, I wanted to give a trigger warning. I said, there's some sexual abuse in the story. And so, if you're interested in reading it, I just want to make sure that you know that. And they kind of just looked at each other and they were quiet and they said, okay, thanks. And then they left. And then their mother came back and she stopped by the table and she said, my daughter said that I should look at this book. And I said, oh, okay. Do you know anything about Scientology or, this is my story? And she said, no, but my daughters were sexually abused when they were younger. And our family has been dealing with that. And she told me kind of her whole story. I mean, she was so open about it. And I think also because I'm so open about it, it gives people permission, to have that conversation. And she told me the whole story and how the family was healing and that she really wanted to read that story and that would hopefully help her, with supporting her daughters and kind of where they were on that journey. And to me, that was so powerful. I just never, ever expected that kind of a conversation to happen when I was writing my book. And especially a year ago when it was just coming out. I thought it'll be a Scientology book on the shelf, and that'll be it. And I'll have told my story.
Right. So, that's so powerful. I got goosebumps when you were talking about how the mom came back in and clearly the daughters had mentioned something. There is something about telling the story that can be very liberating, but I think also very clarifying about how for so long, and still for many people, they carry the secrets, as you're saying, they carry the shame, even though it's not something they did to somebody else. But even if it's something that happened to them, somehow you're not supposed to feel right about it. And just in terms of you being able to say, this happened to me. And there is often an unspoken message that people get that this is not something to tell. Sometimes people are told directly, but others just intuit this is not something to tell, and they carry it with them for a lifetime. And I really like the fact in that story that you told about the daughters and the mother, that she was open about it, that she could say, this is something that happened to my kids. And you also, I think, give people the reminder that it really is something that you get to share if you want to. You don't have to, but you have the freedom to. And it doesn't mean something about you except that something did happen to you that has left a mark in a variety of ways. And I really love, like the woman in France who had the big trial who said that shame changes hands, right? Changes sides. There is something very important about that. And so was that in your telling of the story, I'm curious about that part of the story, and then we'll move on to other parts. I'm curious what the thinking was, the process of, no, I shouldn't tell. We have a lot of secrets. I don't know how people are going to take it. I don't know how I feel about exposing it, to saying, no, I'm actually going to put it on paper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was definitely a choice, of I could have kept it a secret. I could have not included that, in writing my story. But that was the impetus for writing, is because those repressed memories started to come out, and that was, probably good 15 years ago now. But I had lived with that secret for decades. And I had known for decades that there was something there with my father, that I had this memory of sitting on his lap and him telling me that this was our secret, but I never knew what the secret was. I could never remember the secret. And so when that finally, was unrepressed and I started writing it down, I really didn't know what I was going to do with it except to just acknowledge it and to say, okay, I guess this happened to me because these memories are not going away. And I've always wanted to remember what that secret was. And now I have some visuals, I have some smells, I have some, all the things that come with memory, because you don't have a clear picture always, especially if you're younger. But there was my bed. There was the feeling. There was, the sounds. There was, the different things in my bedroom that I remembered, the touch of the bedspread, the touch of different things. And so I thought, I really think this is something I've got to deal with. I've got to figure out what happened here. And so I wrote and wrote and wrote about it. And then that's what happened with the writing of the story, is that I realized that abuse happened for several years, and off and on throughout my childhood. And I started to try to figure out, well, where were we living? What was happening in my life at that time? And that's when the chronology of Scientology started to be written, because that's where we were. We were, always following Scientology. We were moving around, and my parents were, always going someplace else to find, a new organization. And we went over to St. Hill, to do all of that training and auditing for my mother. And so there were lots of pieces there that I had to reconstruct to figure out, where did that story fit? So that was the biggest piece of kind of deciding, where does that fit in there in my story? And then as it really turned into a book, and I realized that I did have this story about Scientology that somebody else might want to read. And I've read so many other, people's stories. I thought, there is a place for this maybe, because it's a really specific time in the Church of Scientology, because I was born into it in 1958. And then, we lived it through the 60s and the 70s. And really no one had written about that time, aside from Janice Gillum Grady, who's written, about the Commodore's messenger and being on the ship. In kind of the long way to answer your question, I kept it in there for a while. I kept the sexual abuse piece in there for a while, and through edits and through writing and through, refining the manuscript, I found that it was really important to define who I was because of that, and how my relationship with my mother was influenced by that, mostly. And my relationship with my father, but mostly it impacted my relationship with my mother. And I really came to terms with understanding that, of how I aligned with my father, with the abuse, and with Scientology, because my mother was always the one that we were having to get fixed through Scientology. And she was always the one who needed more auditing and training. And, she was the problem in Scientology. And that was why, we kept moving and following it. So that really made sense to keep it in there, to tell that part of the story and to give some context, I think, for that. And after you've written about it for so many years, because I wrote a long time, it took me about a good 4 years, to 5 years to really come to terms with, okay, I'm telling this story, and what is this story going to look like when it's told? I don't want to say it desensitized it, but I was able to make sense of it and to accept it, and to say, okay, it's just one other part of me. It's one other part of me, just like growing up in Scientology was one other part of me, just like being a mother, just like, being an educator, just another piece of me, just another piece of who I am. And that really helped me with the healing.
Yeah. I think it's a very kind of sophisticated way of looking at it, that is a part of who you are. And it is. I mean, we are all shaped by our experiences, the good and the not so good. And what I remember from talking to you last time is that you have an interesting way of thinking about your father, and thinking about what happened, and thinking about your mother, that there is this complexity. There isn't the black and white thinking. There is the really trying to understand, and not just deferring, not saying, okay, I don't matter, my experience doesn't matter, I just want to understand them and what made them tick, etc. Really getting into how it all impacted you, but understanding the humanity in each of them, and the psychology in each of them, to whatever degree that a child of can, which I really like. And I think that not having to sort of assign yourself to a certain camp, is really good. It's also really kind of opposing Scientology thinking, right? The black and white, the good, the bad, and the I'm going to be over here and everyone else is over here. Who's the enemy, etc. So I like the approach to it all.
Well, it's taken a long time to get to that approach, but thank you. Yeah. And, you made me think of something also in that, experiences form and shape us. So definitely growing up in Scientology formed and shaped my thinking. But also, I think something I've come to terms with being a sexual abuse survivor is that when you're sexualized at a really young age, it changes how you, or maybe I should just speak up for myself, but I think it is true. It changes how you view the world. It changes how you view who is going to protect you, who is going to take care of you, who's going to view you through different eyes. And I think very much that happened with my parents in that, my father tended to still be my protector because my mother was always so involved in Scientology and really not there for me. And, even when she discovered the sexual abuse, she did not stand up for me and she did not stop it. And so that really influenced, that relationship. But also, I wanted to speak a little bit about, Scientology in the 60s and definitely in the 70s when I was a teenager and when I was involved, because I've reflected on this kind of over the course of talking about my book, that, the 70s were kind of, free love, that generation, right? And part of my own feelings as a teenager were because of the generation of, that's, it's free love. Like, you could be involved with somebody who's, older or not, or, it wouldn't be an odd thing to think about. And there I was immersed in an organization that had a lot of young people in it that were experiencing free love, and that was happening in Scientology and all over in the 70s. And the other piece of that is going into it with the viewpoint from Scientology that you're just, a thetan, which is, their version of soul or whatever, in a young body. And so here you are in this world now, and you just happen to be 14 years old right now in this body, and, and here you are, immersed in Scientology. And so I think that thinking, along with the repercussions of being sexualized at a young age, I saw myself as someone that could be sexually active during that period of time. It made perfect sense to me. And, I really had not reflected on that until talking more about it and thinking about that period of time. Because when I go to bookstores, I have this picture of me when I was a teenager involved at the first Church of Scientology and Celebrity Center that was in downtown Los Angeles. And so I put those pictures up there for context when I'm talking to people. And it's always shocking to them. Oh, wow, that was you as a teenager, like you were a teenager there. And the more I looked at that and thought about that period of time, and I thought, and I write about it in my book, I really saw myself as an equal. I saw myself as an equal with the 20-year-olds and, 30-year-olds that were there. And I was perceived as one. This Scientologist, I clearly remember, and I write about it in my story, he said to me, "You're just here in a young body right now. It's very cool. You're here in Scientology." He goes, "But, maybe when you're older, we can get married. We can be together." And I don't think how much older I had to get. I don't know what he was thinking.
Yes, hard to know. Mm-hmm.
Probably jailbait, right? Like 18.
Yeah. It would not have been legal adjacent.
Exactly. Legal adjacent. Yeah. So, so that's, that's been an interesting piece of it. And when I talk to, and like I said, those are some of my readers are these younger girls, teenagers that are drawn to the story. And, maybe because of, like I said, I have those pictures up there, but even without those, that's who I've seen are interested in the story. And I think part of that is just wanting to know, it's out in the social media, it's on TikTok, Scientology and all of that, and they want to know more about it. But also when I tell them, that I was a teenager when I was involved, that's really interesting to them. Like, what was that like? And I feel like that's been really powerful to have those conversations with young people and to talk about, this is something, that happened to me. I was born into it and I really didn't have a choice. And that seems really fascinating for them to learn more about it. Their jaws kind of drop. It's been funny.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This idea of being a Thetan, being reincarnated, being billions of years old, however old, and however many planets you've lived on, and
Right.
right, right. So you've come here already quite experienced and even ancient in a lot of ways. And so that actually makes me think a lot about how within Scientology and a lot of other groups, children are not treated as children. You don't get to have the kind of life that people expect within a quote unquote church. In fact, I see billboards here in LA and other places where now they're really doing a pitch for families with children, and there are pictures of, mothers holding their kids and, curious about Scientology, and I shout out the window,
Yeah.
"No,
Right.
run." Because that child is not gonna be seen as a child, is not gonna be treated as a child. You may not be able to have access to that child. That child might be taken away. That child might be someone who has to kind of deal with growing up without, having compassion, or, being able to take a break, or if they go early on into, the Sea Org, who knows what their life is gonna be like, but it's not gonna be the typical trajectory with a real awareness of child development. And that I think, and it's also reminding me of these girls, some of whom I knew growing up, who became these groupies. They would go to Hollywood Boulevard and follow the bands, and they had a lot of experiences, some that they don't ever wanna talk about and some that they are open to, and some never got married because of it, but they, were thinking they were older, but still developmentally you are at the place where you are, where, you can't force your own development, your own chronology. You think you're mature enough to handle certain things, and I think you also grow up quickly in groups like Scientology because you have to face a lot and face a lot on your own. But still, you are a teenager, and people will have that same view when they see pictures of themselves. And they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I was little. I'm smaller than the people I just look so innocent and young, and that is not the way I was feeling inside, and that wasn't the way I was treated." But if I saw someone that age, I'd probably think of going up to her and saying, "Okay, sweetie, can I get you some lunch?" Like, it would
Right.
be that kind of energy, right?
Right.
It's very interesting.
It is. It is. And, talking about the push now with Scientology and children, as an educator, it's just so unsettling to see it. As an ex Scientologist, it's so unsettling to see it. And I'm afraid, like you are, for these young people and children that are born into Scientology now because of the books that have been published. I don't know if you've seen anything about those. And so these books are being published by Scientology now, which is Bridge Publications. So if you see any books by Bridge Publications, just know that it's Scientology's publishing arm. Don't buy them. Don't read them. But they're being published and they have cute covers that have animated characters on them. So they look like children's books. And they're to indoctrinate young children into Scientology. And so what's happening is as Scientology is getting, they're diminishing, they're not getting lots and lots of people into Scientology as they'd like you to believe. But for families that are, for whatever reason, attracted to it, and I would say that a lot of families now, it's about people that have money because that's who they're attracting are people that have money that can pay for the services. And so, young families and have these little kids and they're indoctrinating them just like you would say Sunday school. where the parents are going to go do their thing and then the children are going to go do their thing. And they're reading those stories, they're talking about those. But I saw pictures also of these young children being put on the cans. So the e-meter, which is Scientology's, ridiculous technological tool that really only, measures your sweat and perspiration and your grip on the cans. But they say that it tells your mental state. So they have kids with these little tiny cans holding on to those, looking at the e-meter, and the adult telling them probably, think of something good, think of something bad, think of something, that you're afraid of, think of something good that happened to you, and showing them, oh, look, the needle's doing this, the needle's doing that. And that indoctrination is happening to little children, younger than I was as a teenager. It's horrific. And I don't know what to do about that, Rachel. It bothers me so much. I write about it. I post about it. I've written Substacks about it. I out it as best I can. But with Scientology's tax-exempt status as a church, it's really hard to make that stop.
And it is something that is talked a lot about in the support groups that I do. People are, the emotions run the gamut from being enraged to really being saddened that this is going to happen to another generation of people. And that instead of Scientology learning its lesson about what wreckage it can cause, it's just learning how to perfect its marketing skills, which says so much about it being a business. And businesses should not get tax-exempt status.
Right.
And so I wonder, when you're talking, just for a few moments, if you can talk a little bit more about what happens in that space when you're holding the e-meter cans and they're asking you to think about different things. Then what? Based on what the needle does, where it hovers, what does it mean? And where does that quote unquote counseling, because it's not counseling, but because you're kind of led, where does that usually go? Where can that often go?
Yeah. And people ask that, a lot. So I always like to give the disclaimer that my experience in Scientology was in this 1970s as a teenage auditor. And that's when my training was. So, what has changed over time is the e-meter looks fancier. I know that. I don't know if the questions are any different. From what I hear and what I read and what I hear people speaking out about, not really much, because L. Ron Hubbard is still source. And so anything that is done in Scientology has to come from source, L. Ron Hubbard. And all of the training that you do are all based on his writings. You're reading everything he's written, and you're having to, show how you understand that. And then when you get to the auditing piece, it's based on levels. And so those levels of, I call them, it's fake enlightenment, but, that's the best word I can come up with. At each level, you're supposed to be learning more about yourself and clearing out, those memories that you have and those, what they call aberrations and engrams, which are really like trauma, to trying to deal with that. So as an auditor, I know that I had prescribed questions and a prescribed protocol. And that was based on, like you said, the e-meter needle. And so if you saw the needle like slamming down to one side or the other, like that told you, oh, you hit something. Something's going on, and you want to dig a little bit deeper, with your questioning. And I had that happen as a teenager. There was a gentleman that I was auditing, and he was talking about something that had happened with another male in the dormitories. And even though I'd been sexualized as a young child, and even though I had some understanding of relationships between men and women and what happened, and I wasn't naive, I didn't understand and didn't have any reference point for homosexuality. And this man was sharing something that had happened that way. And I wrote everything down. I kept asking the questions, and he just kept looking at me and telling me more. And I started to feel really, really uncomfortable because I knew that it was something not right. and that we weren't getting to resolution with it. Because if we got to resolution with it, the more you ask the questions, then that's supposed to free up the person who's being audited, and the needle would start to react differently and, might start floating or moving, not as hard. Because really, that man was probably so nervous, grasping the can so hard, right? And perspiring. That was what that was all about. But when I reported all of that, because you had to give it to what they call the case supervisor. So that's the person who's in charge of all of the auditing sessions, and they read your notes and then they tell you, okay, these are the next set of questions and things you're going to ask and do in the next auditing session. I was called in. I was interrogated about what happened. What did he say? What else did he say? And I didn't really understand what was going on. I really felt like I had done something wrong. Like that's how I was treated, as if I had not asked the right questions, or as if I had, not handled it correctly. And, what happened was they call him a pre-clear, but the PC, he was taken away from me. He was taken away from me, and I don't know what happened. I never saw him again. I was never, allowed to be his auditor again. And, my guess is, knowing Scientology, it just went underground. It went underground, and, whatever happened, which was sexual abuse, from what, he was telling me that I really didn't understand at the time, I'm sure that was never reported. I'm sure that was never handled. No one ever made a report to the police. Scientologists aren't mandated reporters. So, nothing like that happened. But that incident was really disconcerting to me, and really taught me also, on the other side of the coin, Rachel, which is so funny, is that as a Scientologist, when I was getting auditing and I was being asked questions, I never told the truth. I never was going to share, because I was afraid of what was going to happen. So I only would share what, I kind of learned how to read the room early on. And I really would only share what I knew was going to get, they weren't supposed to smile, but, a sort of a smile and, oh, your needle's floating. And because I would only think of happy things, and I would only go so deep to, get to that place. It's a very bizarre practice, and the e-meter is just such a strange tool to put in the room with those kinds of conversations, because it really does have that feeling of lie detector test, because the person on the other side of it is seeing something happening when you're talking, and that's controlling how they're responding to you.
Right. Right. Oh, there's so much about this. So I think that there is this guise that it's scientific then, because there's the machine there. And it goes along with the tech, the fact that, Scientology has what they call their technology. So, I mean, it kind of follows suit even visually. I think it also gives this impression that a person can't be trusted, that what they say isn't necessarily going to be real. And so you need to notice the lie detector test. Basically, you have to see what happens there according to the science, even though people can cheat lie detectors too. What I find interesting too is this idea that you have to follow source. And so you have to do it just like L. Ron Hubbard said, which should mean, according to that it's perfect and impervious. But you knew how to get around it. And so many people do, and so many people will tell me, I was hungry. I wanted to leave the room. Like, I got to get out. And so I was like, yeah, sure. Right. That's right. That's what happened. But then it goes into your file and, to be potentially used against you, which is a whole other problem, which is really, really dangerous. I know that I did counseling, and usually when I meet with someone for the first time, I'll take notes just to kind of get some information, their address, what contact info, and I did just the original, like the names of family members, what the stuff. There was someone who had come to see me and who had been through a lot of auditing, and as I'm taking these notes, he's getting so anxious, and he's staring, and he's asking me what I'm writing down. And so at the end of the session, I said, you know what, let's do this differently. I'm going to hand you these notes. they're handwritten, so they're not going anywhere else. It's not in a computer, and you can keep your notes. If I need to refer to them, if I need to remember your sister's name, let's say, just remind me. Because I thought, if I put them in a file, I want him to trust me that it's not gonna go anywhere, but why would he? We learn adaptations based on our experience that help to protect us, and he needed to know what I was writing down, he needed to know who was gonna see it, and at the end, when I just handed him I said, "Here, and here's an envelope to keep them in or whatever, you can have them." Then he kind of trusted me, but I thought, yes, it clearly shows that his information was used against him, and that is so unfair to put people in that situation. And then also, to add another thing in here, and then I want you to be able to talk more, you learn how to lie, you learn how to skirt also as an adaptation. And then if you're caught, you might be, blamed for it or told that you're a liar or that's another aberration, whatever else, like you go down the rabbit hole. But people learn what's going to keep them out of trouble or what is going to help them hold on to what they've learned to call secrets, but I think it's just privacy. You get to have your private life, and that's okay. And I think that's actually a smart thing to learn how to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not something Scientology wants you to learn how to do at all. No, because they want to know all your secrets. They want to know everything. And, and I think about, the difference with my parents, my guess is my father kept a lot of secrets, even through, his Scientology auditing. That would be my guess. And that my mother didn't. And I think that my mother, because of, the psychosis that she suffered through Scientology and, she became agoraphobic and all of that happened to her was a lot to do with how to reconcile what she was sharing and dealing with, in her auditing sessions. And then how did the responses she got help her or, defeat her? And I think clearly they defeated her. She's really someone that needed mental health, resources. She really needed that. And she never was able to receive any of that. And Scientology only exacerbated, her anxiety, her fears. Can you imagine if she's sharing and then those questions are going deeper and deeper, and this is what your needle's doing, and, it's going on and on and on, and just like you said, down the rabbit hole and trying to figure out, well, was it this life or was it a past life? Because that's what Scientology is always trying to get to, because if it didn't happen in this life, it happened in some other lifetime. And so getting you to try to recall another lifetime. And, if my mother, and I believe she did, tried her very best to believe that and to fabricate it, as so many Scientologists do, right? She could not reconcile that within everything else that was going on in her head, with her anxiety and with her own, mental health issues. And that's what led to that psychosis. I mean, I wholeheartedly believe that. And so for people that don't learn the adaptation, and I was thrilled to hear you say that other people have lied, because I've never told anybody that before. So now that secret's out. Yeah. That, they've learned how to adapt, and they've learned, what gets them to that next stage in Scientology of, oh yeah, I'm doing all the right things, because that's what it's about in Scientology or in a high control religion group or in another cult. You're doing all the quote unquote right things to get to that next level and to be accepted into the cult and to show that, you can keep the secrets. You are in this insular group that you believe everything we're saying to you, and you're not going to out us, you're going to stay true to it. And so people that have, adapted, they've done well in Scientology, because they've bought into all of that, and they've figured out, okay, that's my survival. That's how I'm going to survive in this. And I think there's pieces of it that you have to believe to, not go crazy, if you've made that adaptation, because you've had to accept many of the, beliefs, what source is saying, but you've also learned at some level how to survive by doing what is necessary.
Absolutely. And I want to just say something else about this, just because you brought up a really interesting point about, and then we'll go back to the response to your book, because I want people to hear more about that. The fact that you said, I haven't told that story, and also you're happy to hear that other people lied, means that that's not something that's shared. It wouldn't be safe. You don't know who's going to be doing a KR on you, like a knowledge report. You don't know who is going to, seemingly for your benefit, because they're told that it's for your benefit, they're going to be writing up a report on you. So who can you tell? And if you had learned at a young age that people said, oh, yeah, we don't, these aren't trained professionals. These aren't therapists. They don't know really they don't know about psychology. Like the fact that a man is telling you about the fact that he was sexually assaulted or, molested. And how are you supposed to know how to respond? Even people who are older, who haven't had any training, are not going to know how to respond. That's why there's some clergy people who will get pastoral counseling practice. They will learn, they'll get training, because people were coming to them and saying all these things had happened, or I'm suffering with this, and they didn't know what to say and what to do. You'd had no actual training, and none of the auditors, from my knowledge, have had they're not psychologists, and because they'd be against that anyway in Scientology. But I think that, like, if I'm working with someone where they say, oh, I have a real problem with my husband, my wife, my parent, my child, because they're not truthful, they're just not honest, they lie a lot. And they kind of want me to help them come up with a behavior model, almost like as a consequence model. That's the last place. Sometimes that is important to get to, but we want to start with the why. What makes it hard for that person to tell the truth? What makes it impossible for them to feel like they can do that safely? And maybe it has to do with your relationship with each other. Maybe it has to do with their past. Let's find out. Let's figure it out. Not just be punitive, not just say there's something wrong with you, that you weren't being honest. Some of your thinking got you there to say, oh, I better not tell. And sometimes people don't know that at first, but they know that second, after they see how their truthfulness was responded to. And then they learn. It's a much more complicated picture than the way it's treated in most cult groups.
Right. Because telling the truth is built on trust and built on, the understanding that I'll tell you something and there won't be repercussions that are punitive, right? I might not like what you tell me, and there might be consequences, because there's natural consequences that happen sometimes, when you've lied. But I'm here for you. I'm here to support you and get you through that. Where that's not the mantra in Scientology. It's more of a gotcha. It's okay, we know you have these things. We know we're going to dig as deep as we're going to dig, because that's what's going to get you to total freedom. And so, the more we dig, the closer you're getting to that. And so it becomes part of the process of, okay, I don't really want to tell these things, but I know that if I tell these things, they're telling me that will help me get closer and closer. And so that's what I want, is the carrot at the end. And so it's almost like a deception. They're deceptive in that way to get you there and to out you. And then, like you said, then they have this file of all this information about you that they can use against you later on down the line. And it's very punitive. It's very punitive. It doesn't have the feeling of, even though you see all the ads, I've just, reached this level and I'm feeling so great about this. Now I understand. And I remember in my book, I write about when we were on the ship, the Scientology ship, my mom had to undergo ethics. So ethics is kind of like court in Scientology, or justice, right? And so whatever it was she was doing, which it's hard for me to imagine she was doing anything that required ethics on the ship. I mean, we were all out at sea in the Mediterranean. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do except be on the ship. And so she was receiving auditing. And I found these archived reports from the ethics officer, and they were my mother's testimonial about receiving ethics. And what she said, and I don't have it, verbatim, it's in the book, but basically what she said was, now I understand the importance of ethics. I understand that without ethics, the tech can't go in.
Wow.
And I thought, oh, wow.
Wow is right. Yeah. And just to clarify, ethics in Scientology is not ethics as we know it.
No, it's not. It's not. There's no integrity there. No.
No.
I mean, that's what they're trying to get to. Like, you have to be true to Scientology. It's the integrity of Scientology. And so if you're not doing something that Scientology mandates, then you're out ethics.
Right. Yeah. And I think it also is a way to kind of launder a group's reputation if they have this whole huge department that's called ethics, because you're going to assume that it's translated the same way that we learn to translate it outside of Scientology, and it's really not at all. It is police force, it's court, but in-house. But it's interesting that she found a way to make it make sense.
Yes, it is. And I wonder if she did, or if she wrote that in that moment, knowing that's what I have to say.
Yeah, right. You don't know.
No, I don't know. Yeah. That's always been the conundrum for me. That's why I wrote the book, also to try to make sense of it. Like, were my parents these true believers? And I think for sure my dad was. I think my mom was on the fence most of the time that she was in Scientology until she, there was an out for her. But I think she vacillated, between believing and then having, like I said, whatever was going on with her mentally, having that, that dissonance happening with her, because that's what was always happening. It was like, yeah, Scientology is saying this, but I'm not having that happen in my life. I'm not getting there. Something's still getting in the way.
I wonder also, when someone has a lot of emotional upheaval, like your mom, how much they are feeling calmed by having some sort of either an answer suddenly, whether they believe it or not, it's just the answer. Okay, here it is. Now I can breathe a little. Or that they got people off their back by writing what they needed to. And that felt calming too. Again, another situation with a lot of complexity. But I really feel for your mom. My goodness.
I think it was about survival too.
Survival.
It was, how to survive that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Right. And people will say that, though. They've often said to me, like, I was in a fundamentalist group and I was told to speak in tongues, and I had no idea. I wasn't feeling the spirit, but I knew I had to say something. So I just made something up. And people then were saying, oh, how wonderful. And, she felt the spirit. And she's like, no, I was just really tired. I was tired of being there. And I didn't know what else to do. Okay. So moving on to the fact that now you are hearing from people who may have been in Scientology, but it has touched a much wider audience for a lot of other reasons. And so, similar to the story in the bookshop, so tell me what you've noticed. What are some of these universal truths and universal experiences and relatable parts of your story to that broader audience?
Yeah. Well, it's been surprising to me. Like I said, I thought it was a Scientology book, and that it would sit on a shelf, and it would be one more memoir about that. But what I've found is that readers, like I had a gentleman who came up to me, and he came straight to me when I was in a bookstore, and he said, I have to get your book. And I said, oh, you do? I said, why? And he said, because I've just left, and I want to say it was a Muslim sect. I can't remember the name of the actual sect, but that he was leaving that. And he had not really even told his family yet. He just kind of started backing out and was not participating anymore. And he was afraid. He was looking for, I want to say like a roadmap in a way, like, okay, you left and you did this. And he knew about Scientology and he knew it was a cult and he knew that it was something that people try to leave. And he was trying to make sense of where he was in his process of leaving. And he said, I'm afraid to tell my family. I really haven't said much about it, but I've really, stopped going. And then I've have these family members that I'm not speaking to anymore because I really don't want, to have to explain it to them. And I said to him, I said, well, I'm not sure if my story will help you, but I think it might, in that I grew up, in Scientology and I didn't have a choice. And that was his story also. He was raised in this religion and he didn't have a choice either. And I said, so it took me a really long time to figure out what it was about and to deal with those memories. And to, I left when I was a teenager and told him a little bit about my family. So I said, I'm not sure, but I think it might help you with understanding family dynamics and understanding, your relationship with your parents within a really high control religion like that. And so we had that conversation. And he said, no, I'm really interested in reading this. And, he got my book. So that was really very surprising to me. I have had people, from evangelical religions come up a lot and talk about, they've left that. And, they always ask, was it hard? Was it this? And I always talk about, well, it was a long time ago. So because I was a teenager in my family, we all kind of left at the same time for different reasons. But I'm so glad that I did. And I learned so much in leaving and then in writing my story. And they shared, growing up in an evangelical church was very insular, just like Scientology. They were told what to believe and how to believe. And there was only one way of thinking, and that was the right way of thinking. So a lot of parallels there. And that I really didn't expect to hear in talking to readers. I didn't expect for them to make that connection between those parallels. And I think the good news is that there's so much known about Scientology now. It's not as secretive, as it used to be because people are outing it right and left and divulging the secrets. And so people know a whole lot more. And I also talk to people that have come up to me like at book festivals, and everybody has, especially in Los Angeles, some sort of Scientology story of somehow how they were approached or a relative or a friend, who got involved. I had one woman tell me, Rachel, and this was just really hit a nerve as well. It was a foster care family that were Scientologists.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's what I said. And so she was telling me this whole story. And so, and she was involved as a social worker. And so she said this teenage girl was like 16, 17. And that's what kind of drew her to my story because I was a teenager at that time. And she said, they're trying to get her to sign a contract. They're trying to get her to join the Sea Organization. And so once that information was divulged to the social worker, they were able to go in and to get her and the other children removed from the home.
Wow.
And I know I was astounded by that story. I was just astounded. I mean, I was so thankful, that it had a good ending. But yeah, she really needed to, and I don't think she's probably, gone around telling that story to that many people.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But, I was the right person to listen to that and to make that connection for her. There's lots going on with it that we don't know about. And I think that's what alarms me as well, is that they're so insidious. They're just so sneaky about how they're infiltrating and how they're disseminating, that was One Hubbard's word, it's about the dissemination, you've got to get it out there. You've got people to, you've got to make sure, people understand about it. This is what's going to save them. We're going to save the planet and all of that. And so all of that is still going on, but they're doing it through, this woman was also telling me, like down in South Central LA, they're doing it through homeless shelters. They're doing it through food banks. They're doing it, in places where people are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
With the umbrella of, we're helping them. And not to say that, religions don't do good work in those venues. I mean, they do, when they're giving food and when they're, working in soup kitchens and they're helping out and they're providing those resources like the Aftermath Foundation does, for people that are getting out of Scientology. But, Scientology is not in there doing anything besides disseminating Scientology.
The foster family story is so hard because these kids already are having such a hard life. And then to be told to sign a $1 billion contract, which is trippy in and of itself. And they might think it's binding and, it's a meaningless thing, but it feels very meaningful at the time. This idea of also that there are these people who will be wearing Scientology vests and get in the van and go to where there's been some sort of natural disaster or something to do touch assists or whatever it is that they're going to be doing.
Right.
I know someone whose job it was to be the photographer on those runs and to use them for publicity. And even as like a building is burning, I don't know if this is true of everyone, but she was telling me that it was her job to have everyone stand in front of the van with their vests on so she could take photos and they could be posted. And then she had to make sure that it was okay and it wasn't blurry and it was posted and it was all fine before they went. So again, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it just showed at least where the priority was in that moment. And it wasn't necessarily on the people they were going to, but they needed to be a presence, like with an innocent, like with a bystander who stops because someone was in an accident or they have a flat tire. They're not going to, put on a vest from an organization. They'll just go help. It's a very different reasoning.
Oh, it is. It's all about publicity. Yeah. And I'll assure you, I'm sure they're putting on those vests for the photo op every time.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's what it's about.
It's
about showing, that they're humanitarians that way. But so I will share this, and I'm just thinking about this, Rachel, is that I've become braver. So, everybody says you're courageous in telling your story and all of that. And I don't feel courageous in telling my story, but I feel braver in speaking out. And so in the beginning, it was like, okay, well, this is my story, but, I don't know how I feel about speaking out about Scientology. There was still that fear decades later, of what's going to happen to me. And I remember talking to, probably to you and to other, podcast interviewers about that fear of, will there be any retaliation? And so I've learned that, that didn't happen to me. And so I've gotten a little bit braver about speaking out. But also, I think part of that comes from these stories, like you said, about, a foster youth or about, people that are, putting on those vests and pretending, that they're helping the world, and these books that are published now for little children in Scientology and putting them on the e-meters, that, and I don't want to say rage, but outrage is probably the better word for that. That outrage, bubbles up. And I think, no, this has to be stopped. Somebody has to do something about this. And so, if my voice can have one person be more educated about it and be a little bit more in the know about it, that's going to help. And I feel like it's that ripple effect. And that's how I felt about my book and telling my story in bookstores. It's like that ripple effect. So, for those people that come up and talk to me and get my book and read it, then maybe they give that to someone else or they share that story with some, this is a good book. You might want to read this. This is what it's about. And then that, is that ripple effect that it gets wider and wider and more people have knowledge about Scientology. I think we're ripe for that right now in the way that cults are being outed, and are being talked about I was reading this article, and it was from a UC Berkeley professor. And this was just a year ago, June 2025. And it was about, he teaches a course on cults at the university level. And he has them, and it's all different cults. So he has them watch a variety of, YouTube videos or documentaries. Going Clear is one, that he has them watch, but several others. And young people are interested in it, in wanting to understand it, wanting to be more informed. There's this hunger for that and to learn more about it and to make these decisions for themselves about, is it a cult or is it not? And to try to, wrap their brains about, like, why would someone join that? Because that's always the $1,000,000 question. And he talked a lot about the only reason that Scientology is considered a religion and not a cult, and he talks about this in his class, is because of their IRS status, because of their tax-exempt status. Had they not been able to secure that back in the 90s, because they lost it during the 60s, and there was that long period of time where, they didn't have it and they were outed. And, when L. Ron Hubbard died and David Miscavige took over and he was able to secure that, that really set Scientology on a different path, sadly, in that they were able to claim, that we're a church and we're tax exempt. And he talks about in, his class about, so what makes the difference between a cult and a church? And he basically, that's what he says, is tax exempt status. There's so many other differences, but for Scientology, that's really what it's become. That's what it's about. And so I always talk also when I'm at my book talks and at bookstores is about the aftermath. I always make sure I have bookmarks that have the information on it so that people can research that also, because I want them to know that even though these horrible things happen to me and to others, now there's an organization, that is doing the right thing to help people to get out of Scientology, and that I support that. And they're really always so interested in that and approving of that. I think that gives, I don't want to say gives my story credibility, because there's credibility in it, but lets them see the full circle of the fact that, yeah, I grew up in it. Yeah, that happened to me. But now here I am, and I've chosen to say, this is what happened to me, and to try to make sense of it, but also to do something to try to change whatever the trajectory will be for other people.
Right. Oh, it's incredibly powerful. And I think they benefit from the fact that just the term cult is now known. People might still not know how to define it. And of course, cults love to define or redefine the definition so it doesn't fit them. But I love that there's a course on it. I think there needs to be more of that. I've worked hard putting together curriculum for different schools. It was never quite picked up because people thought, well, there are other issues that are more important. And I thought, well, really? Freedom seems important. So that everything else you're teaching them is possible, right? Like, then they can go on to a career. They're not going to get abducted, kind of pulled away. I think it is very important when you talk about feeling brave and feeling strong and feeling like, here I am. I'm kind of standing up tall in my life, in my history, and you're going to be bringing that into your future, I'm sure. There are people also I know who will read books like yours because they're thinking about maybe telling their story, and they want to know how to approach that. Is that something that you also were getting comments about from people?
Yeah, definitely. Especially at book festivals. I was actually in Berkeley. There was a book festival up there, and I had many people come up to me who were starting to write their memoirs, starting to tell their stories. And even though, it wasn't similar, it had similarities in that they were trying to make sense of either a religion they had left or a way of living that they were trying to steer themselves away from, and to make sense of the why and to move forward, because that's always what it's about. How do I get unstuck from this belief system or from what happened to me? And how do I try to make sense of that through telling my story? Because really in the writing of it, you're helping yourself. That's the first person that you're helping. But as you tell that story, you're helping so many more people, that I didn't really ever imagine, that I would be helping. But they did. They wanted to know, like, how did I start? And what was that about? And almost, some people want really technical advice about writing. And I always say, that's really something, you should probably find on your own what fits for you, like a writing workshop or a class or, a retreat, because there's so many out there. But if you're thinking about the why and where do you start,
Yeah, right.
that you're going to have to go inward to find. And you're
Okay.
going to have to figure out, what is your why in telling your story?
Mm-hmm.
What's the reason? And once you figure out what the why is, then the story will come because you'll find the avenue for it. It will be the vehicle for telling the story and for helping you make sense of it. And so those have been powerful conversations as well. And, I share with them, this is one way that I chose to tell my story. And this is why I chose to tell it this way from my vantage point as a child growing up, because that was the way that I was most impacted was as a child. And, but for you, it might be something different. It might be, into adulthood, or it might be a combination, but you'll have to take that journey and to figure that out. So yeah, those have been really good conversations as well. And I'm sure that they will write their stories. I mean, it takes time, but if they're at that juncture, they're probably going to write it if they're talking about it. It's not just in their head.
Yeah, yeah. So I know we're going to be finishing up, and I just think about how lovely it is. At least in my mind, I'm picturing that picture of you as a teenager, and now here, having been able to look back on that time, have a lot of insight, use it in a way that is helpful to you and your healing, and be able to put it out there for so many other people who can relate to it on so many different levels. But also that you're in a place now at even in terms of the time frame that we're in, where there are more people telling their stories, and that it's not as shocking because people noticed that was what was happening originally, that there was this shock value, and people were looking at it in a much more sensationalistic way, not the human way, that this is a story of an upbringing that was different for these reasons, but also the same for these other reasons, that the struggles that I had and parent-child relationships and secrets and. But I think about how much you had to do on your own growing up. And now just, I think, to feel heard, to feel supported in this must feel really nice.
It does. It does. And I always like to end it when, people they do feel sad. There's that sadness when they learn the pieces of the story. And I always like to say to them, but, here I am today. So, I'm okay. I'm okay today. I survived all of that. And there's hope. So there's hope, but also there's forgiveness. And I always like to end on that piece, and not that I forgave my father for being a sexual predator, or forgave my mother for the dysfunction that, happened in our family and how she wasn't there for me, or forgave Scientology for the things that they did. But it's that forgiveness that comes through understanding, is that I can forgive them in that that's who they were at that time in their life, and that their actions were the actions they chose for whatever reasons they chose those. And so in forgiving them, it's giving really forgiveness to build strength in myself and to help me move forward, to say, okay, I don't condone it, but I can forgive it so that I can move on with my life. So I'm not stuck back there hating them and having that rage fill me. And that has really helped me the most on my journey, is to be able to get to that point. But it's taken years and years and years. So it's not a linear journey, I always say. It's a winding road.
It is a winding road, yes. And I thank you for inviting us on this road with you. And where can people find your book and things that you've written, or just places that you might be out there in the world with your book?
Well, I'm on social media. Clearly Lies Are True is the name of my book. So you can find out all kinds of information about me and my book on Instagram and on TikTok. I also have a Substack. So Substack at Clearly Lies Are True if you want to follow that. That's been my writing journey and also my Scientology journey. I also have a link tree, which has, all of my podcasts and everything, and a website, which is Clearly Lies Are True as well. So if you just Google Clearly Lies Are True, that'll take you everywhere. And my book is available on Amazon. It's a paperback, it's an ebook. It's also an Audible in my own voice. So that's kind of a powerful journey if you choose that one.
Perfect. So nice to catch up with you. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. It's always a pleasure to be on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
One more thing before you go. Thank you so much to Pamela for not only talking more about her story and about some of the things that she needed to do when she was growing up in Scientology, like figuring out how to manage her time with the e-meter during auditing and how much to share, how much not to share, but also with the responses that she's gotten from her book, which has now been out for a year. It is really gratifying to hear that the comments have been really, really good ones. I remember years ago, my colleague and friend, John Atack, wrote a book about Scientology, about his time in Scientology, and about some of his insights that still is called A Piece of Blue Sky, because within Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard said that he could somehow give you or promise you a piece of the blue sky once you became a member. He made a lot of promises. And that book was actually one of the first or one of the only books that was taken off of Amazon because of Scientology pressure. Then it was put back on Amazon. And so those were the days that I remember sort of coming up in this field where it wasn't safe to talk about what you experienced and to talk about what you learned. So not only is it nice to be able to see where we are in our world now and our landscape of being able to talk more freely, but that Pamela also gets the experience of hearing from people who feel that her story resonates with them on so many different levels. Something I want to come back to that she talked about was this idea of holding secrets. Within controlling environments, within controlled relationships, within fundamentalist branches of religion, a lot of the time, within cultic groups, anything that is private is considered problematic. You're not supposed to have a private life. You're not supposed to have private thoughts. You're not supposed to have private communication. You're not supposed to have private wishes. You are not supposed to have private dealings with anyone, even if they don't threaten your ability to be full members of that group or true and honest partners to that controlling person. Still, it's a threat. It's a threat because it's a thread. It's a thread not only to the outside world, but to your inner life, to who you are. And it ties you, it pulls you. And people who are trying to control you want you to have no ties to anything else, not even a tie to yourself, to your true nature, to the goals that you have, to the things that are really on your mind. They don't want you to be able to keep those inside. They need to have access to all of your information and to all of your thoughts and all of your feelings. And the reason, of course, is because information is power. And it's also sometimes just a power play. That if they can get you to share your information, but they don't have to share theirs, then they reinforce that the relationship, that the connection is completely uneven. where you have to divulge things they don't. You have to account for where you just were and who you were just with and who you were talking to on the phone, but they don't. You have to give over your passwords. You need to tell them how much money you have in your account if you have money in your account. They need to know, even if you were going for a walk, if you stopped to talk to anyone. And sometimes controllers and controlling spouses will even have a stopwatch, and they will say, you came back 5 seconds later than you did yesterday. What did you do with those 5 seconds? I mean, it gets really where you feel hounded and like a prisoner. The idea that Pamela could see, and she was able to be open, she said, for the first time during this episode, about how she needed to sometimes tell things that were not true. She had to share information that just helped her get through an auditing session, Scientology's form of counseling. I'll use that in air quotes, their counseling. I think that it's good when you see that in yourself. And it's good also to not judge it when you see it in yourself, that if you find that you're needing to tell stories or you're needing to withhold information just to be safe in a certain environment, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've done something wrong. It means that the environment itself is one that is so limiting, that is so controlling, that is so manipulative, that is so in need of knowing everything about you, that you're saying, I actually need to have something that really is my secrets to myself. The other thing, though, that happens within controlling environments, within cultic systems, is that the word secrecy is used. You are not supposed to keep secrets. That's considered evil. And often when I help people change the word to privacy, that they have the right to their privacy, like I did in my conversation with Pamela just now, then it doesn't become like somehow you have secrets and you're doing something so evil, or you've done something so evil that you need to keep it secret, and that somehow you're doing something wrong by keeping secrets. You have the right to your privacy. If it's not hurting anyone else, yeah, if it's hurting your controller's ego, if it's hurting their sense of overall control over you, I think that's okay. But if it's not something that's like putting someone in harm's way, etc., then it's okay to keep things to yourself. You also just get to say, this is mine. And I know everything within a cultic group needs to be shared. Everything within a controlled environment needs to be shared. Of course, just in one direction. You have to share everything. But you get to have things that are just yours. You get to have thoughts that are just yours. You get to hold on to things, because what you're also learning is sharing them is not safe. Sharing them is going to put me at odds with the people around me. Sharing them is going to make me get labeled. I'm going to be called lots of names. If I tell people that I am not really believing in what they're saying, or I'm not really wanting to stay, the people who are upfront about that, the people who are open about it, by the time they leave and they come to see me, they have been so beaten down. They have been so exhausted by virtue of their honesty. And I'm not saying to not be honest. I'm just saying that within unhealthy environments, there is a price to pay for telling the truth. And it doesn't mean, again, that you are a quote unquote liar. And a lot of people who are manipulative, who are gaslighting their partners, will call them pathological liars, just because they might have forgotten to tell them about a phone call they had with someone that day. Well, you're now a pathological liar and I can't trust you. And they have to demonize it and diagnose it. But really, what you are saying, if you're just sort of skirting information, hiding information if you need to, is you're saying to yourself, I now have seen what happens, how I'm treated, or how the people around me are treated when they say what's true. And I don't know if I want to have to go through that. And I don't know also if these people who are mistreating me deserve to have my truth. Because sometimes your information can be also reinterpreted, reframed as a gift that you give people who deserve it. And if they're showing you that they don't, then you don't actually owe them anything. Thank you so much to Pamela for sharing what she went through and what she's come to see and what she's come to find out. And also, I'm very happy again that her experience with putting her story out there has been such a good one. Talk to you all next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @Indoctrination Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.